More tales told by a Dubliner, by Turlough Conmee. Story number 6. The Madness of Dane Swift. It was in the year 1739, in the house of Dane Swift in Cathedral Close in the city of Dublin. Swift's servant Pádraig was sweeping out the main reception room with a broomstick, and as he swept, he sang a cheerful song. Pléaráca na Ruarcach, the Carolan the ducking the donig the marin go fall, shot with muck. Mortagus quaira da gascart dun gasre ga chelo. Ced polish gevehas na madra godiana, the gairi imagine is a convenient sport. Brishag de fiatus, a slad of my focus, good oak de brichtus, a lushgach machlocus, Chair me vared malin is midid, o dimming na gared a shaft manoch low. Meanwhile, his fellow servant Seán was coming up the back stairs with some wine bottles, and he stopped and joined in the lusty chorus. Good spracker and glasha, shine sauce and Pléaráca, and boxish and aniugus grado glenol. They both had a good laugh at the end of it. Soon appeared the Dane himself, in his Geneva gown and his full-bottomed wig, and he stopped and asked them, "Pray tell, what was that song you were singing? I hear it everywhere these days when I go about the streets." "God save you, Dane," says Pádraig. "That is Pléaráca na Ruarcach, and a grand song it is too, by the great Mr. Carolan." "Aha," said the Dane, "I know of him certainly. But what is the song? Tell me what it means, for of course I know no Irish." Pádraig put on a grave air and said, "Pléaráca na Ruarcach means the feast of the O'Rourkes. They held a great feast one time in the west of Ireland. Isn't that it, Seán?" "Aye, that they did," says Seán. "It was in the county Mayo, a famous feast by all accounts, that went on so long it turned into a drunken rout." "So, what do the words say?" "Well, Dane," says Pádraig, "they just tell of the feasting and merriment, and how drunk they all were, and the accidents and pranks that happened, and the fights that broke out between clergy and laity." The Dane laughed heartily. "That sounds like a good one. And tell, did the great Carolan make this poem up by himself? Was he there in person?" "Divil a bit, Dane," says Seán. "The feast happened years and years ago, and the poem, if my memory serves me, was written by Carolan, a comic poet over there in Mayo. He was a great friend of Carolan, it seems, and he asked the master if he would compose music to it on his harp, so that it could be sung as a song. Well, no sooner said than done. He composed an air, and now it's sung in the length and breadth of Ireland. And in the streets of Dublin," added the Dane. "Even in my own house." "God save you, Dane," said Seán with a roguish smile. "Would you not want us to be singing?" "Sing away," replied the Dane. "Especially that one. I like it." So they did. Pádraig swept with his broomstick, and Seán carried his bottles back and forth to snatches at the song and its chorus. The following evening the Dane had company, and among this company was Mr. Delaney, a man of the cloth in the established church like the Dane himself. Mr. Delaney was an accomplished man, and a musician of some ability, so he was always been asked to play the harpsichord in the large reception room. The Dane, not being musical, never played it himself. This time the visitor obliged his host and the rest of the company by sitting down at the keyboard with an armful of sheet music and playing a sprightly piece. Well done, exclaimed Dane Swift, as the others applauded. And pray what was that? A piece from the suites for the keyboard put out by Mr. Handel, replied Delaney. Ah, yes, said the Dane. Handel. Delaney couldn't help smiling sarcastically at his friend. I recall when they talked of bringing Mr. Handel to Dublin a while ago, you would not give him the cathedral to put on his new sacred oratorio. He will have to do it in the theatre instead. And quite rightly too, growled Swift in recollection. A mere fiddler is not going to take over my cathedral. Delaney laughed at this stubborn display of pique, as did the other guests. My dear Dane, I fear you have been missing out on the musical life of Dublin, whether it be Mr. Handel, Signor Gimignani, or not forgetting the true Irish harper, Mr. Carolan. Apropos of Mr. Carolan, said the Dane with sudden interest, do you know that song of his? He hesitated, looked around, and saw Seán waiting on the guests. Come here to me, Seán, he said. What's that song by Carolan you have been assailing my ears with? Pardon us, Dane, said Seán. Wouldn't that be Pléaráca and Ruarcach? That's it, said the Dane. Turning to Delaney, he asked, do you know it? Could you play it? Delaney nodded and played a few notes on the keyboard. Isn't that it? I think so, said Swift. Then turning back to Seán, he said, go fetch Pádraig wherever he is, and bring him back with you. Seán left, and soon returned with his fellow servant, who had been in the kitchen. Now, boys, said Swift to them, sing that grand song of Carolan's again, so Mr. Delaney can hear it. Away ye go. Seán looked at Pádraig, and after some hesitation, Pádraig dutifully began to sing. Pléaráca na Ruarcach, da hólan gach duine, da ducking da dánig da marin go fóil, seacht vihid muck, mort agus coire da gascart dun gasre ga chéil. And after a while Seán joined in, not sure of the words, and they sung it to the end. Bishop de fiepse, sladach ma focus, godach de vlichtese, noshgut ma chlocus, heil me varied, maling mis midead, o dimig na garead, or shachtmenoch leo. Gorspracker and glashach, shine sauce and Pléaráca, boxes shin on you, grad law. Good, said the Dane. Now, Mr. Delaney, can you play it by ear? I think I can, said Delaney. God knows I've heard it enough in the past while. He began to play. He got through it with a few hesitations here and there. He would look up at the two servants, and one of them would hum the missing part to jog his memory. At the end, he played it over, even adding some trills at the end of the chorus. Bravo, said the Dane, and all the guests applauded. Of course, said Delaney, Mr. Carolan is a harper after the old Irish fashion, and he would not play it on the harpsichord. Yet I hope he would not be displeased were he here. He is a fine musician, is that what you would say? Asked Swift. Very fine, said Delaney. Indeed, when Signor Gimignani was in Ireland, it's chanced that he and Carolan met at a certain gentleman's country house. Gimignani and his band of musicians played, and the gentleman turned to Carolan and asked him what he might have to add to that. Mr. Carolan thereupon took up his harp and played for the company a whole new piece, rather in the Italian style, which has since become known as Carolan's Concerto. Later on, 'tis said, Gimignani composed a piece which he had sent down from Dublin to Carolan, asking his opinion of it. When Carolan heard it, he liked it, but he suggested some improvements, which were duly noted down. When the corrected score was brought back to Gimignani, the Italian exclaimed, speaking of Carolan, that he had il vero genio della musica. Very good, said Swift. Well, my dear Delaney, I pray you to write down the notes for this air, so that you can play it for us again. Delaney replied that he would do his best. A week later, Mr. Delaney dropped by again, and with him he had a few sheets of music in pen and ink. It was his transcription of Pléaráca and Ruarcach for the harpsichord. The Dane pronounced it good, and called Pádraig and Seán to hear it, whereupon they too expressed polite approval. Now, said the Dane, we must get the words of it from the two boys, written down, and I will also that ye give us a word-for-word English version, so that I may then turn it into verse and rhyme, and in the end we will have a song fit for any drawing-room. Well, more or less, he guffawed. So the Dane got the four of them sitting down at a table, for all the world like a party to play cards, and the labour began. Pádraig sang the words slowly, repeating them spoken. Any gaps in his memory were filled in by Seán. Mr. Delaney, who knew a fair bit of Irish, had pen and paper at the ready and wrote them down. When the task was done, he read them back to the two servants. They concurred, with a few corrections here and there. Then Delaney began to translate the thing laboriously into English, with help from the two servants. The work had gone on for long enough, and the men were tired, but the coarse jokes and other scabrous descriptions caused loud guffaws every so often, and Swift joined in the merriment. At the end, Pádraig and Seán were given the rest of the evening off. As they went out, Pádraig growled to Seán, I wish we had never sung that song. As for Swift and Delaney, they spent some further time going over the rough translation, and then they parted, with Swift promising he would work it up into a poem that would fit the music. A week later, there was a new merry gathering at the Dane's house in Cathedral Close. Delaney was there at the keyboard, but at first Swift appealed for quiet to his guests and recited his new poem. O'Rourke's noble fare will ne'er be forgot by those who were there or those who were not. His revels to keep, we sup and we dine on 70 sheep, fat bullocks and swine. Usquebaugh to our feast in pails was brought up, 100 at least, and a matter our cup. Oh, there is the sport, we rise with the light, in disorderly sort, from snoring all night. Oh, how I was tricked, my pipe it was broke, my pocket was picked, I lost my new cloak. I'm rifled, quoth Nell, of mantle and kercher. Why then, fare them well, the deal take the searcher. Come, harper, strike up, but first, by your favour, boy, give us a cup. Ah, this had some savour. The company laughed and applauded here and there, and at the end, when Swift proclaimed, a blow on the wham, or a kick on the arse, there was a roar of laughter from all present. When he said, that's all, the laughter descended into applause. Nothing would do Swift now but to hear the words sung with a harpsichord accompaniment. Having no singing voice himself, he sat down with Delaney, and the two of them sang it, with Delaney playing the keyboard accompaniment. The performance was rather tentative, as they had difficulty fitting Swift's verse to the Carolan air. Delaney prolonged the last syllable of each line to match the notes. They did the best they could. At the end, Swift told everyone, more notes than words, I fear. Ah, well. Delaney promised to do what he could as regards producing a song with music that could be printed. And a week later, he was able to sing and play the song, simplified a bit, in a way that fit Swift's words better. The audience applauded his effort. Pádraig and Seán heard snatches of it from the kitchen. Begod, said Seán with a sigh, it's a different song now. Aye, said Pádraig, but that's the difference between Irish and English. It's too much of a leap from one to the other. In the weeks and months after that, a great change came over Dane Swift. He had always suffered from bouts of ill health, but now there was a visible deterioration in him. His mind and wit were affected too. He complained to his friends that he was no longer as sharp as he was. It took him a long time to find rhymes for a piece of verse, and it was a torture to have to think them out, not like the times when he had effortlessly churned out things like O'Rourke's Feast. What was more, he had become peevish and was very critical of his servants. Pádraig and Seán came to resent their master's hard manners with them, and they lost their habitual cheerfulness, which once had so pleased the Dane. Things came to a head one day when Seán had come home a bit drunk from an outing and had ruined a fine lobster freshly caught in Dublin Bay, which Swift was going to bring as a gift to a noble family he was to visit. Faced with the damage done by the hapless Seán, just as he was about to get into the coach, the Dane flew into a rage and came into the house with the coachman's whip in his hand. He proceeded to beat Seán unmercifully with it, and Pádraig and the maid were quite unable to pull the Dane off him. The luckless servant was left bruised and cut all over. After this, Swift got in the coach and told the coachman to drive off. Pádraig took Seán into the kitchen and bathed his wounds, trying to comfort him, for Seán was sobbing to himself with pain and humiliation. Pádraig left him alone for a while to recover his spirits, and recover he did, for when Pádraig came back to the house later, he found Seán pacing up and down in the kitchen. Seeing Pádraig, he pointed to something he had chalked on the back of the kitchen door. It said, D. Pádraig asked, "What is that supposed to mean?" Seán shouted, "The divil double damn Dane Swift!" Pádraig laughed out loud at this, and then Seán joined in, but still his laughter sounded bitter. On the Dane's return, no word was spoken about the matter. Perhaps the Dane had forgotten it, though to forget such an outburst was unlikely. Certainly Seán and Pádraig had not forgotten it. The Dane was as peevish as ever, and he spoke to the servants harshly more often than not. Pádraig and Seán took to muttering D to one another when they passed in the house on their business. It had become their cipher of resistance. After some time, the Dane even stopped calling them by their names. When he saw one of them he wanted, he would say, "You there!" Another sign of peremptory bad treatment, I suppose. No doubt. But it occurred to them after a while that he'd forgotten their names. The two servants began to find scraps of paper in drawers and on desks in the Dane's handwriting that said, "Jonathan Swift, STD, Dane of St. Patrick's Cathedral." This told them that not only was the Dane having trouble recalling their names, he had trouble remembering his own. He had always been partial to walking out in the streets of the Liberties and around St. Patrick's Close. But now he went walking for hours at a time and came home exhausted. Seán said to Pádraig, "He loses his direction and he's too proud to ask anyone the way. So he needs hours to find his way back. That's what it is, I'm thinking." It was hard to know now what sort of a temper the Dane would be in. He might get excited and agitated over trifles, or he might sink into a state of numbness where his eye was vacant and he spoke not a word. When he did speak, he found it hard to think of the words, and the servants would have to help him, suggesting words and trying to guess what his wish might be. In the end, the vacant mood became the predominant one. He demanded nothing, and the servants had the run of the house and could do as they pleased, for even visitors had begun to stay away. Only the faithful Mr. Delaney came by, and he invariably left with a tear in his eye, or else shaking his head sadly. Pádraig and Seán still muttered D to one another in passing, but they muttered it louder now, for who was to query them? They had also taken to singing Pléaráca and Ruarcach again. They would sing it together as they worked, sometimes dancing a minuet with the broomstick as if it was a partner. They sang it in front of Dane Swift. He seemed to remember it, and his eyes lit up when they sang the chorus. Finally he would ask, with a distracted smile, "What's that?" "Oh, you know well what it is," said Seán. "It's Pléaráca and Ruarcach, the song by Mr. Carolan. Sure, didn't you have us plagued to tell you what it meant? And didn't you put English on it yourself?" "Not that it did you any good," interjected Pádraig. "Sure, haven't you forgotten it again?" "I tell you what," said Seán to Pádraig. "We'll teach him to sing it, this time in Irish." "Oh no," said Swift, shaking his head and smiling vaguely again. "Oh yes," said Seán vehemently. "Well, at least the chorus," said Pádraig. So they sang it for him. "Come on now, Dane," said Pádraig encouragingly. "Shine Sosan, Pléaráca." The Dane shook his head. "Come on now," said Seán angrily. "Isn't it about time you learned some Irish? For weren't you born here and lived here all your life? Except, I suppose, when you were gallivanting over in London. It's the true language of the country. Only you gentry have the English, and we have to learn it to serve you, of course." "Come on now," said Pádraig, and he sang, "Gur sprackar and galashach, sign sauce and Pléaráca, and box a shin on you, this grad oglan. Swift looked at him in great puzzlement. "Come on now, you old divil," said Seán, giving him a hard whack with the broomstick on the shoulder. "Shine sauce and Pléaráca." Swift looked at him wide-eyed. Then he mumbled something that sounded like, "Shine sauce and Pléaráca." "That's right," said Pádraig with grim satisfaction. "Now, if you please. Shine drasser and glorshach." Seán raised his broomstick threateningly. Swift cowered back, but he managed to mumble something like, "Shine drasser and glorshach." "Grand," said Seán. "And bucks a shin on ye." "And bucks a shin on ye," mumbled Swift dully. "Agus grad ogrin nol." "Agus grad ogrin nol," mumbled Swift after him. "Isn't that grand?" exclaimed Pádraig. "We'll have him singing the whole song before too long. He can sing it with us. A trio, no less." "We'll have him speaking Irish before we finish with him," said Seán with a sour laugh. Looking back at Swift, he told him, "Let your meditations be on a broomstick." This became their daily sport. They sang the song over and over, and the Dane seemed to have an uncanny knack to echoing each line he was prompted to say. But often enough he had to be additionally encouraged with a blow of the broomstick. Meanwhile, rumours had begun to fly around the Liberty streets that Dane Swift, always known as a great eccentric, had finally gone mad. People came up to Seán in the street when he was wheeling his cart of provisions to Cathedral Close and asked, "Is it true?" "Is what true?" demanded Seán severely. "Bless us, that the Dane has gone mad." "He always was a bit," Seán told them sagely. "It's just a lot worse now." He told Pádraig of these inquiries. "I hope none of these bastards come prying around the house," he said. "Well, now, I don't know," said Pádraig, suddenly thoughtful. "Maybe we could turn it to our advantage." "What are you thinking of?" "Well, I've heard of these lunatic asylums they have over in England and France, where they let people in to see the antics of the lunatics, on Sundays, say, as an amusement. They charge them admission." "How much?" asked Seán, with sudden interest. "6pence a go, is what I heard." "You mean we should let people in to see the Dane and charge them 6pence?" "Why not?" "You know, that's not a bad idea." "I just wonder if he's mad enough," said Pádraig. "Of course he's mad," said Seán. "Sure, don't we see it every day?" "I mean antics, though. Madmen need to have antics, they do, to amuse the people. Otherwise it's no fun for them to watch." "Begod, he could sing Pléaráca and Ruarcach." Pádraig grinned. I suppose that would be strange enough, all right. The upshot of it was that they sent word around the Liberties that visitors could come to the house and see the mad Dane in all his insanity for the sum of sixpence on Sunday afternoons. Meanwhile, Swift had made great progress with Pléaráca and Ruarcach. He could sing the whole thing if you prompted him with a few lines. When the people of Dublin came full of curiosity on Sunday afternoons, they saw a dazed Swift brought in, looking wildly around him, and it was announced he would sing a song of Mr. Carolan's. And sing it he would, prompted by Pádraig with the words, and beaten by Seán with the broomstick. Well, some of the people roared with laughter. Others just marvelled, thunderstruck. But they generally agreed it was sixpence well spent to see such a wonder. In these days, Swift was often left alone at home. Sometimes he would sit in his private dressing room, sometimes in the privy, a place to which he'd always liked to retire for long periods. As he did, he often thought of nothing, and could think of nothing. But then that cursed song would come into his mind, and he would hum, Pléaráca and Ruarcach a gcuireann gach duine, dá ducking dá dánig dá maran go fáil. The song would not leave him, the tune with its sprightly rhythm, nor the satirical words. Not his own words, which he'd once put to it and now forgotten, but the original words in Irish. The words seemed to gather in his brain, like the flocks of black crows that roosted in the trees of Cathedral Close, outside his windows in late summer. The crows sat chattering in the treetops, and his brain was filled with all sorts of Irish words. Every so often the crows would arise from the trees, noisily cawing, and circle round the house before roosting in the trees again. There seemed to be no reason for it. Every so often a cacophony of Irish words would burst in his brain, and his thoughts and mouth were filled with them. There was no reason for that either. He found himself muttering Irish words. Misha tá oignach a nocht, oignas an dawn is trónach with ein hagan con kainter manish. Perhaps it was not so strange. The Irish words grew in his brain and on his tongue, like some new flowering bush that grew in his garden. Yes, there were green things growing everywhere around, and their names were Irish. They spoke to him in Irish, and he spoke Irish to them. Tá mé mo híle fada, agus an grian ag dul faoi imwe. Benníam an grian, agus an gealach, vi choki genias, sorry vad. Benníam na blahana, agus na tur, agus na creen mór himpel orm. Ma vanach liv ille, tá mé ma hoivnis. One morning, Seán came running down to the kitchen to find Pádraig. Dear man him, but you're pale, Pádraig said to him. Have you seen a ghost or what? He's speaking Irish, said Seán. Who is? The Dane is. So, said Pádraig. Sure, hasn't he picked it up from us with the help of the broomstick? A stick is a great teacher. Ah, no, said Seán, almost tearfully now. That was different. That was just words to a song. But I tell you, now he's speaking Irish. To you? To me, to himself, to anyone around him. Pádraig was looking a bit puzzled now. Maybe he knew it all along, he said. Well, he wouldn't have learned it in Dublin, surrounded by these Protestants all from England, and he wouldn't have learned it from the earls and dukes he consorted with over in London. We'll have to look carefully at this, said Pádraig finally. Take me to him, will you, so I can hear this too? They went up to the reception room. Swift was sitting there in a dressing gown, his head covered by a turban instead of his full-bottomed wig. He was mumbling distractedly. "Éistenish," said Seán quietly to Pádraig. Swift became aware of their presence. "Is true nach raibh mé ag caint libh mar seo riamh ribhe. Bhí an Sassanach in Corastium. Cé nach Sassanach mé féin," Swift chuckled. "Ní hé, ach is gael mé ó Halamh na Héireann." Seán became upset at all of this. "How would you divil? You're no Gael at all. Sure, there's not a drop of Irish blood in you. Weren't you telling us, burn everything English except their coal, and you as English as the rest of them? The great Irish patriot, Maria. Weren't you telling us we should eat our own children or sell them to the Sassanach for food? I suppose you thought that was funny. Agus gaeilge agat an ish." "Dear God," said Pádraig, "he must have learned it somewhere all right." "He didn't learn it from us," growled Seán. "All he got from us was a song." "Is he possessed by the devil?" asked Pádraig suddenly. Seán shook his head. "It's God that makes the dumb to speak, and men to speak in strange tongues." Pádraig was the first to recover himself. "Look on the bright side," he said. "The great Dane Swift spouting Irish. That's well worth a sixpence. I just wish he wouldn't talk Irish on his own account. There's something not right about it." "What?" exclaimed Pádraig scornfully. "Make up your mind, man. First you bait the Irish into him. Now I suppose you want to bait it out of him again." Seán just hung his head in a kind of wordless grief. Anyway, it was just as Pádraig had foretold. People came in droves on Sunday afternoons. They paid their sixpence and saw and heard the Dane of St. Patrick's, whose voice they'd often heard preaching or reciting from the Book of Common Prayer, speaking Irish, a language they didn't know themselves, being Dubliners of English stock every one of them. "O Ghine Ursula," Swift said in a loud voice. "Laudigi lamse agus cahigi an berle oivanish, maris changa an rie, shorshe do, plaike gur chomelesh fwy eirin, agus muinsen a heirin, maris chomelesh fwy hasan a fein." "Aber an Tauron," Seán hissed at him, alarmed at this seditious talk about King George. "Pléaráca and Ruarcach," and Swift would begin to sing, not very well, for his voice was feeble, but unaided. "Pléaráca and Ruarcach a gain and gachtina, na ducking da danig da marin go fáil, shocked for het mok, mar dagus quaire da gasket and gasly gach in. When not being exhibited to the locals, he went on speaking Irish, often with no great sense, but sometimes with seditious intent. He even spoke it to himself. Pádraig and Seán could hear him holding soliloquies, even when he retired to the privy, which he'd always liked to do. They heard him from behind the privy door declaiming, "Cock Madrachas, Nílanson sail nach Cock Madrachas, is Comacadian and dinner an Talav, Sehir an Ashke is August Sehir an Ashke a vig on Gudio, Shin Mahorim." Then he would be likely to end his soliloquy with a soft rendition of "Could a spracker and glashach sign sauce and Pléaráca, and boxish and onigus grado." Now, this state of affairs could not go on forever, and after a couple of years, the cathedral chapter applied for their dean to be made a ward of court, as he was, they said, of unsound mind and memory. They dreaded the chance of him turning up at services and wanting to preach. It had been bad enough him bowing to the holy table like any papist. Scandal was to be avoided at all costs. And they knew that in the house in Cathedral Close the manservants now ruled the roost. So they got him made a ward of court. Not long after that, in the year 1745, more remembered now for other events, the Dane died and was buried in his cathedral. When his will was proved, they found he had left a tidy fortune, but he'd given the whole sum to build a hospital for the mad in Dublin. It was built too, and at first it was known as Dr. Swift's Hospital. It's said that for many years afterwards, the ghost of the Dane often appeared in the corridors at night, where he was seen by the inmates and caused them much unease. But since they were mad, no one paid much attention to their reports. Yet it became a standing joke among the people of the Liberties who had known him that the mad Dane was most at his ease among them that were as mad as himself. You have been listening to The Madness of Dane Swift by Turlough Conmee from More Tales Told by a Dubliner. If you liked the stories on this channel, don't forget to like, share and comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. So, until next time.